All right. Thank you for joining this morning's virtual panel, podcast Pitching Like a Pro and Avoiding Pitfalls. This year, the number of monthly podcast listeners is expected to increase by 10.1% year over year to 117.8 million, according to Insider Intelligence. With the popularity of podcasts continuing to grow, strong opportunities for many PR professionals exist, yet many PR pros are still not leveraging the full power of podcasts. This panel discussion, hosted by PRSA Detroit, will cover best practices PR pros should keep in mind when pitching clients and stories to podcasts, as well as some of the potential pitfalls to avoid. Before we get going, a few housekeeping items. So as we're going through, please drop your questions into the chat. Our moderator, Nikki Little, will walk through those at the end of the program. We'll answer as many questions as possible. And if you'd like to stick around at the end after we conclude, we will have some casual networking. If you've been on some of our programs in the past, you know that we open it up to where the attendees can communicate with the panelists and the moderator. Please feel free to hang around for that if you've got some extra time. I'd like to mention an upcoming program that we have in October. So on October 14th, we will be hosting another virtual panel, Diversity and Inclusion, Answering the Call to Crisis. So this panel will take place from noon to 1 p.m. And the speakers will include Tina Kozak, CEO of Franco, Bridget Hurd, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan VP and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Walter Kraft, Eastern Michigan University VP of Communications, and Sean Wilson, Boys and Girls Clubs of Southeastern Michigan President and CEO. Before I hand it over to Nikki and introduce her, I do need to read PRSA Detroit's antitrust statement. So we read this at the beginning of every PRSA Detroit meeting. PRSA's policy is to comply fully and strictly with all federal and state antitrust laws. Meetings and programs held under the auspices of PRSA must be conducted in a manner that avoids the fact or appearance of conduct that may violate the antitrust laws. Participants are not to discuss industry-wide or individual company prices, current or projected, or matters relating to pricing such as costs, profits, contractual terms and conditions, wages, salaries, market allocation, market shares or sales, clients or customers, or other competitively sensitive information. Compliance with antitrust laws is a requirement for PRSA membership, and responsibility for compliance rests on each individual member. Participants in PRSA meetings and programs have an obligation to terminate any discussion, seek legal counsel or advice if necessary, if the discussion might be construed to raise any antitrust risks. With that, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Nikki Little. Nikki has been in the communications industry for nearly 15 years and is currently the vice president at Franco, an integrated communications agency that works with B2B and B2C clients in a variety of industries. In her role at Franco, she manages the digital team, leads several integrated accounts, is part of the company's executive leadership group, and oversees all agency marketing efforts. She's the publisher of the MichComms Report, an e-newsletter for communications professionals in Michigan. Nikki also serves on the board of Impact 100, Oakland County, where she handles email marketing. She and her husband, Mike, live in Huntington Woods with their 8-year-old twin boys, Nolan and Evan. So with that, Nikki, I will hand it over to you. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us bright and early. I'm going to do a brief intro of our panelists here before we jump into the questions. I want to start with Donna Givens Davidson, the president and CEO of Eastside Community Network and co-host of the podcast Authentically Detroit. Donna has more than 35 years of nonprofit leadership experience in areas of youth and family development, community economic development, community partnerships, and community education. Over the years, she has developed and implemented demonstration programs and worked in partnership with a number of organizations with the consistent goal of increasing opportunity, building capacity, and fostering growth. Now serving as president and CEO of Eastside Community Network, as well as lecturer at Columbia University School of Professional Studies, Donna formerly served as president of the Youth Development Commission, CEO of Visions Education Development Consortium, executive director of Vanguard CDC, VP programs, Big Brothers Big Sisters of Metropolitan Detroit, and in leadership positions at several other nonprofit organizations. She serves as vice chair for Pewabic Pottery, board member of New Detroit, Michigan College Access Network and Urban Research Centers, member of the Bridge Detroit Magazine Advisory Council and the Charles H. Wright Community Advisory and Action Council, and steering committee member for the Lower East Side Action Plan, Building the Engine for Community Development in Detroit, and the Detroit Residents First Fund. Donna co-hosts a weekly podcast, Authentically Detroit, with Orlando Bailey. She also serves as an adjunct instructor at Columbia University in the School of Professional Studies Sustainability Management Program. Donna has earned a Master's of Ed Leadership from Wayne State University, Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Michigan, and a certification of completion from the Harvard University Summer Leadership Institute. James Potter is the founder of Raphonic, and James has been working in the tech industry for almost 10 years, and he currently heads up the podcast outreach database Raphonic, which is a way for PR practitioners, marketers, and brands to get access to data and contacts for more than 2 million podcasts. Solo practitioners and agencies use Raphonic to find, qualify, and pitch the right shows. And finally, Jer Stays, co-host and co-founder of Daily Detroit. Jer has broadcast TV, sports, social media marketing, and corporate communications experience over a career spanning 2 decades. His credits include WDIV, international networks, Detroit Public Television, and more. He also handled social engagement for the Detroit Regional News Hub, working as a concierge for over 1,000 journalists over 5 years from around the globe, telling the city and region's stories. Okay, so we're going to start with questions. So the first one is, how can PR practitioners most effectively identify and pursue pitching opportunities with podcasts? So James, I'm going to have you start answering this one first.
Hey everyone, glad to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm here in this lovely field. So yeah, I think you briefly touched on podcasting, how fast, how quickly it's growing, and the percentage of listeners is growing by a good amount year over year, and I think it's a growing channel for PR practitioners, and because podcast listeners tend to be loyal, sort of highly engaged audiences, and so. So people who kind of pitching guests onto podcasts or even sponsoring them tend to see high ROI and high conversion to whatever they're talking about. So how can PR practitioners effectively identify pitching opportunities? Well, there's a lot of kind of disparate data about podcasts spread around the web. So if you want to kind of look for a set of shows that are in some niche that you care about, or targeting some kind of targeting some audience, then the main challenge is going to be figuring out, because there's 2.5 million podcasts out there, out of which about 500,000 are active, as in still publishing roughly every month. So it's tricky to kind of sort the wheat from the chaff. So what a lot of people do is, let's say, if you're lucky enough that the niche or the topic that you're interested in is covered by one of the main 90 or so categories in Apple Podcasts, then that's going to help you a lot. But obviously not every topic is covered. But let's say you're looking for business podcasts, then that's a pretty rich category. I mentioned Apple Podcasts because, especially in the US, that's still the dominant podcast player, although that is changing over time. But people use these categories as the de facto podcast categories across most platforms. So that's one way. And then the issue you're going to have really is trying to figure out, for a given podcast, how big is the audience? Like, how many people listen to this? Is it active? Are the listeners engaged? And so people tend to look at, they have their flaws, but people tend to look at the Apple Podcast charts as one indicator of that. So you might be, so each category has a chart. So you might look at the business top 250 and see if a show that you're interested in is there. People look at ratings and reviews of podcasts to see how engaged their audiences are and what their audiences are talking about, and also as a kind of a proxy for how big an audience is there. That's a little bit challenging. And then some podcast apps reveal little nuggets of information about podcasts. So, for example, there's an app called Castbox, which tells you how many subscribers a given podcast has in the Castbox app itself. So those are a few ideas for kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of figuring out which podcasts are worth your time. And then once you've identified a set of podcasts, then how do you pursue them, or send a pitch? So most podcasts get contacted by email. Not all of them want to be, but every podcast has an email address in their RSS feed, which may or may not be useful. But I would recommend going and trying to find a podcast website and see how they would prefer to be contacted. So they may have a contact form or an email address there that's specifically for pitching them. Or they may say, please don't pitch us, because they get overwhelmed. And then as a last resort, you might be able to find social media accounts too, and then reach out that way. Although you may also irritate them. And I think that's a reasonable overview of finding the right shows, trying to qualify them.
Yes, thank you. Jared, I want to see what you can add to this, because you get pitched frequently, right? And I don't want to jump too far ahead to the pitfalls conversation, but when we were doing our prep yesterday, you shared how a big thing is it's very obvious when somebody comes on the show and they have not listened to your show previously.
Yeah, I went ahead and asked our private Facebook group and some of our listeners, like, what is it that you look for in guests? Because look, listeners know, like they know that there is kind of like a message craft or a PR craft to all of this. And they know that people get pitched. And the key is that listeners can tell when someone's never listened to a show. They can tell when someone hasn't even spent 5 minutes to say, oh, this is the vibe of the thing that we're going in. Because, you say podcast, but a podcast can mean a lot of things. Some podcasts are very scripted and produced, and they sound a little bit like audio documentaries, right? And so a pitch for something like that is going to be different than, say, a podcast that is a free-flowing conversation. You also want to match your tone. Some podcasts a little bit more freewheeling, shall we say, with the words. Other podcasts are not. And so you want to make sure that your vibe and your guest kind of match up. And another key thing about that is to make sure that it's something that resonates with the audience. People know and can sense when you're just hitting specific target points or just specific talking points, and you're not willing to go off script, if you will. And one of the challenges sometimes that we have, not to jump ahead, but I think it's clear for a PR practitioner, is that I think a lot of PR people are used to treating us as if we're radio, and we're not. Like if you think about the length of a morning broadcast segment, 3 minutes, 5 minutes max, it's in, out, hey, how you doing, and then you're gone. Well, this is something that like we're short, and we're 15 to 20 minutes, which is a long time for most people used to doing kind of media training and things like that. And I can say that because in my previous life, I've done media training. So I know what, a lot of times is trained out. And I think a lot of practitioners aren't used to that. So when you think about who you're going to select to go on these shows, think about someone who knows how to speak about the company, is rooted in the company's values, is rooted in the mission, because you're going to get asked about it and you're going to want to share details that aren't necessarily just, here is my new product, here is my press release, but in audio format.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. What are some of the benefits and opportunities of storytelling through a podcast versus traditional media? Donna, why don't you start with this one?
Okay. So our podcast, Authentically Detroit, was really just the brainchild of Orlando Bailey and myself sitting around a conference room table saying, how do we get information to people in the community? Our intent was not to engage in professional journalism, but more so in information sharing in the community and lifting up voices of the folks in our community. So it started from a different place than other journalism does, I think. It started from really just wanting to tell stories. And so one of the benefits of us doing it this way is that we speak to people in the community all of the time. And when I'm on the podcast and I'm interviewing people and having discussions with people, I am trying to bring the voice of the people in the community. There's no pretense of objectivity. There is this understanding that I am there as a representative standing in for residents. And so we started Authentically Detroit, and we really started it with the intent of lifting up voices for people in our community, for the listenership of people in our community, but then found that there were people who are in foundations and in government positions who are very interested. And so I'm almost thinking that the audience that we have is not the one that we intended. What we did was make visible, invisible voices. Coffee table conversations went into people's living rooms. We don't edit our podcast. We've only edited out one thing one time, and that was because we made a mistake in possibly embarrassing somebody, but we don't edit it. So when you sit down with us, what comes in comes out. Now, historically, I've been interviewed. I get interviewed a lot by traditional news media. I used to be a guest on various shows. And a lot of times there's always this question, is this what I said? I didn't quite say it like this. And I don't like the tone. I don't like the quote. And maybe I said it, but without the rest of the wording or without the rest of the context, the meaning gets turned around. One of the benefits of appearing on a show like Authentically Detroit is that everything that you say is going to be shared. One of the risks is that it is long. Our podcast is at least an hour every episode. And Orlando Bailey, my co-host, who is a trained journalist, always tries to shorten things and keep me, under control. He's like, okay, Don, we've got to wrap this thing up. But we end up in these great conversations. And usually when we're done, people who are our guests say that was fun. And, even when we ask challenging questions, they thank us. And so some people have asked to have people on our show. Now, we haven't really been approached. We have been approached by some PR professionals. We really don't usually respond to that, only because what's being pitched is not within our, it's not within our bandwidth or our interest level, but sometimes we do. But sometimes people have asked to let people come on in a way to help repair their reputation or help explain things about them that would otherwise not be available to listeners. So, I think that one of the things we're also looking at doing is starting the Detroit East Engaged Network, Detroit Engaged East Side Network, the DEEP network, which will equip more residents and youth in our community with podcast skills so that we can get more people in our community sharing their authentic stories. And they don't have to run through Orlando and me, but people can know that you go to this network and that's how you get heard.
With your planning, Jared and Donna, since you both run your own podcasts, how much of it is scripted and planned beforehand, and how much of it is just authentic and organic as the conversation gets going?
Do you want to go first, or should I?
You can, and then either way. I guess I'll just finish and then you can go just real quickly. We have a run of show every podcast. The run of show, we have actually a song that introduces our podcast, and we say, have the same introduction pretty much, and we introduce folks. We have questions that we identify, and we share that script, that run of show, with our guests so they can be prepared for the questions, the general sense of what we're going to ask. We have people that we want to honor during the podcast, but that's not to say we try to stay with the script, but we also let the move us. So sometimes it's kind of defined, but also it's organic.
I think for me, it depends on the episode. So if we're doing something that's more like a mini documentary. So for instance, I had one of our contributors who actually, before everything happened in Belarus, went to Minsk, Detroit's sister city. And that was more of a scripted, more public radio style piece. Conversations are more free flowing for me because of where my background. I do not share my questions ahead of time. because just, I want to get certain things out of people. I don't want to share, with somebody who's like, we've interviewed a variety of people. I don't want to share all of that. I might talk to them and say, hey, is there one or two things that you really want to talk about on this thing? So that I make sure that I'm fair and I'm like, okay, well, here's the one or two things this lady or this guy wants to do. But beyond that, it's kind of something where we do the prep. And it's a free flowing conversation. The difference for us, I think, and there is no like wrong way, but we actually do edit, but it's not really for content. It's more of time and making sure everything is tight. And a lot of editing happens like in the questioning and hosting process, because the expectation for our show is different. We're daily producing 2 hours or an hour of content every day. Not possible for us. And it's also just a different thing. And then that goes back to my other point, is that like, that's why it's so important to be aware of the podcast you're pitching, because podcast is the same thing as like, okay, it's on a radio station, but like, what is that radio station playing? Is it talk? Is it music? Is it this? So that's why I think it's important to kind of get your feet wet and go, oh, this is the vibe of what's going on. But yeah, for us, there's a lot of prep. I think that for every hour you hear, there's probably 4 to 6 hours of work with our show.
I just wanted to clarify. We ask questions that they don't know about. There's some things come up. Okay. I don't want people to feel safe. Like, oh, you're coming on here. I recently had a podcast and I asked a question and I think the guest was really caught off guard. And I had to ask myself, should I ask this question now? And then I put myself in the shoes of the listener who I knew had this question in their mind. And I said, I've got to ask it, even if it makes somebody uncomfortable, because my accountability is to the people in my community who not the people who are listening, who are not of the community, but the people who are of the community who need to make sure that their voices are represented accurately.
So Jerry started talking about this a little bit, but let's pivot to the pitfalls of pitching and what should PR practitioners avoid doing when they are pitching podcasts.
I mean, there's a few different things. I think we all know, every podcaster knows when it's been spray and pray. Like all of us know, like we look at the inbox and we're like, oh, you are a hot sauce from Iowa. I'm not sure why you're sending me this email. Like I've seen that many a times. I'm just pulling that out of the air, but like I've seen that so many times where it's spray and pray and I'm just gonna delete. Like I'm not even gonna respond to that. And then I think the other thing is trying to think that this is going to be advertorial. It's going to be very different than say a news hit. For a lot of podcasts, I feel this way, and I've listened to Donna's show. I feel like maybe she agrees, maybe not, but like there are pundits and then there are experts. For me and most podcasts, you want to talk to the person who's doing the thing. You don't want to talk to the PR person for who's doing the thing. You don't want to talk for the spokesperson who's doing the thing. I mean, if I need to do a quote for a story, I'll throw in a sentence for like a package story. But for a conversation, I want the person. I want the person doing the thing. And so does the audience. They expect that, because one of the key differences between podcast and radio, every listener for us is an opt-in, which means we have a different responsibility than radio, which is kind of like, okay, we have time to fill. We have 24 hours, or I have a 2-hour show, or any of those things. We have a responsibility, and people can say no and opt out and never come back for us very easily. So in order for us to grow our audience, we need to really honor their time and honor their attention.
Yeah, I think that one of the pitfalls is thinking we're trying to sell something. We don't sell things on our show. We're fortunate to be supported by a foundation so that we don't have to at this point, although, at some point we want to get some more revenue. But I think what we try to do is sell ideas. What we try to do is build connections. So we were the first podcast to interview the new planning director for the city of Detroit. And that was really great. We didn't want him because he was selling something. We really wanted to profile him. We profiled the incoming president of the Skillman Foundation. We have done a lot to profile candidates for public office this year. And we're hosting a debate in a couple of weeks with a couple of candidates who are running against each other in our district. And so our focus is really on that. Now, if you have a candidate who is playing a role in somehow influencing the community, or an expert who can shed light on that, like Jared said, we're interested. But if you want to, somebody reached out to me and wanted us to help promote a charter school, that's not what we do. That's that's advertising, and you need to do your work. And ECN might be able to hold a community meeting for that, but that's not what our podcast does.
I think for us, we end up it's not walking a line really because it's not sponsorship, but our audience is legitimately interested in new businesses and things happening. So for instance, there's a scooter company called Boaz Bikes. You could look at it and say, okay, this is a interview that features a company, but the owner and the people involved in it are from Detroit. Like I literally went down the road to the Russell Industrial Center and like they're talking about the mission and all the things that they're doing. For us, it's kind of tough because we do cover a lot of business and our audience wants to know about new things. They absolutely do. And so it's like, we have to kind of, to some people who are extreme purists who might say, oh, well, you're having a business on the show. Well, we are, but we're also talking about what they're doing because people want to know, okay, well, why are you starting a scooter company in Detroit for Detroiters? What is unique about Detroit that means that scooters are a really hot thing here? Because that's actually a really interesting story. So it's interesting to say, okay, scooters are hot here. And then also, who are the people using scooters, which isn't always who you'd think in like the stereotypes on social media. It's a last mile for a lot of people to get to transit, things like that. And it's being served in part by a local company. So then you start to say, okay, how is this more interesting story and develop it out as opposed to here is my new thing, And also when it comes to development too, my audience wants to know about development over and over. Like they want to know all sides of it. They want to hear from the developer. They want to hear from community folks. They want to see it and say, how is this going to impact the community? And honestly, they're excited about it, but they're also going to have questions about it, especially depending on where that development is. So it's something where you've got to kind of balance that, which is a little different than say, being able to just do community issues.
I agree with you, Jer. We have had some featured a couple businesses, and we would be interested in featuring more and developers who come into our community because that's important stuff. But when you have an issue and you're having somebody who's trying to get an approval for something using political process, I'm not selling that. Okay. Now, once it opens, if you have a charter school and you're just trying to tell people it's here, that's one thing. But if you're trying to get the state authorizer or some other
Did we lose Donna? Okay, we'll give her a minute. Hopefully she'll come back.
draw the line in sort of getting into thorny political issues where we're being used to support something that we can't validate is of the community interest at that time.
So, James, when you were talking about recommendations of finding contact information, and that's something that your platform helps PR practitioners do, would you say, based on your experience and Jer too, from you personally getting pitches, is it preferred to go through email as what is pretty typical for pitching traditional media, or do you think podcasters are more open to getting pitched on social? I'm sure it depends by the person, but I guess from your experience, what have you seen with that feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I see the people who are using my platform, so that's agencies, individuals, or even companies and brands themselves, they overwhelmingly choose email. So I mean, I don't do much podcast pitching myself, so I can only say what my customers do or what I see them doing. But yeah, I think maybe for historical reasons, in that my understanding is that PR practitioners tend to pitch more traditional publications by email mostly too. And so that habit has maybe carried over to podcasts, but also email addresses are quite readily available for podcasts because a lot of them have one listed in their feed. But yeah, I think that you can maybe, depending on how big the show is or how formal it is, or laid back, maybe social media, maybe pinging one of their social media accounts is the way to go to stand out a little bit, because maybe not everyone's doing that. And as Jer mentioned, there's a lot of spray and pray behavior going on. I try hard. I try to kind of encourage people not to do that, and my platform doesn't let you select 50 podcasts and send the same email or something like that, quite purposefully. but yeah, there's a lot of pitching. There's a bunch of lists out there of thousands of email addresses of podcasts, and people buy them and just send the same, maybe slightly modified email to hundreds of podcasts. So yeah, so maybe trying other channels could be a winning strategy.
I mean, email works. Just don't call me insert name here. I mean, it kind of comes in a few different ways. If I know somebody, I mean, and I'm sure that Donna's super connected as well. Like, so it's something where if a lot of times I'll get a text message from somebody that I know. Like, that's part of being around for a while, is you have a Rolodex. It's something where a personal connection will always win out, because they'll generally know what you're actually doing, and you have a trusted relationship where I'm not even going to pitch you unless I think this might be useful. Email, of course, is, I think good. Social can work. I'm not against it. However, I'll tell you that we screenshot you and share you if you do @podcast, come, look at my hot sauce @podcast, look at my hot sauce. We screenshot you and we share it around, just so you know, we see you. And so that's the thing to remember, is that act like a person, I think, is the biggest thing. I'm trying to remember what late show it was, but it was talking about some PR thing. It was like act like a person, just hey, here is my thing. Are you interested? All right, fine. And I think that's also doing your due diligence and saying, okay, is this show might be a fit? Might it not be a fit? I don't think you would spray and pray, say, a newspaper or something like that, if you really wanted to do a meeting with an editorial board or something like that, especially with a show like Donna's, for instance. You're meeting with think of it like that, you're meeting with an editorial board. They're going to hit you with questions, and we do too, but I think think about each individual show and what that's going to be. Now, there's going to be some stuff within your industry that is going to be really great. I'm thinking about when it comes to PR professionals, if you're working in a vertical, lining up to your vertical is super important. And it's something where you might run into a podcast that maybe has 500, 200, whatever, 100 listeners. But if they're the right people for you, and those are the people that are really into the thing that you're working with, you can actually pull a lot of influence there. So it's not just about the raw big numbers, but are these your people that you're trying to reach?
Yeah. I would agree with that.
I was curious, sorry.
Just real quickly, the only thing I'd add is, if you're pitching, can you explain why you think it's a fit and where you think the fit is? I'm much more interested when somebody says, I like what you're doing about this, and I think this is a good fit, than just, let me tell you about my customer.
I was curious, as podcasters, both of you, how sophisticated do people get in terms of trying to pitch you? I mean, will they do things like email your friends and then get your network and get intros that way, or are they not that persistent?
People usually email either Orlando or myself. And Orlando is the director of engagement for Bridge Detroit. So he has a lot of bandwidth. He hosts a lot of shows. He gets a lot of pitches, and he brings the pitches to me. And then there's some people who have an organizational relationship where they're aware of the organization, who come through me, and sometimes through both. Sometimes they email it to our info, and sometimes it's addressed to me, and then sometimes we get it through our Authentically Detroit Gmail. So we have lots of ways of entering, and sometimes they come together and converge. But I would say most often people will go to Orlando, who is more publicly available in some ways.
I think it comes in a few different directions. When it comes to my personal network, it kind of leans I've dealt with a lot of PR folks in the past, but also I have a producer, which I'm very lucky to have, someone who produces and helps edit the show and finish it up. And let me tell you, everyone tries to do everything for Cheyenne. They're always like, well, what is, and she's just like, nope, I don't need any of that stuff. But it's just one of those things that it's funny when you have a producer. I think a lot of people have realized that who is the person that gets through, because I've got so much going on in my day. She's the one who runs my calendar, and some people have realized that, and that's fine. I fully admit it. I have enough to do in my day. But having a producer is something that's really valuable. And I think finding out who is the engine for the show, for you, Orlando tends to be the on-ramp, as you're saying. But I think it's it's all about that personal connection. And I think it's going to depend on if you have a familiarity, if you're working in the industry, if you can provide a unique opportunity for the podcaster. I specifically think too, in industry podcasts, in the prep call, I mentioned a friend of mine who did a welding podcast for a long time. He ended up selling it, but it's something where, in industry level, he was able to do a lot of great things with that. Another friend of mine actually got sent by Microsoft to do his open source podcast at their conference in Seattle. And he was there for 2 weeks. And that's the kind of thing that you can do in an industry setting where there's industry alignment, or if there's message alignment or any of that other kind of stuff, and work out something that's a unique thing. And then also, there's opportunities to work with podcasters, not, the same thing as any other media person. If somebody has something interesting to say or can add value to an event, consider paying them for speaking, consider things like that. Like I know, Donna, you've done a ton of work in your outside podcast work. If you find her things interesting, hire her to speak at your thing. Like that's a thing,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the ways that people use our podcast is try to authenticate what they're doing, who they are, and who the leadership is. And I think that that's the value of working with a podcast like ours. It's not going to be because you have, I don't know how many, viewers we have. We're still trying to figure that out because we're not, our metrics, whatever, we're still trying to work on what our metrics are. All I know is that wherever I go within the foundation and also with Civic Detroit, people are like, I love your podcast. It's kind of shocking to me because I'm like, you listen. So, what has happened is people have sort of sent people to us and said, I want you to talk to this person. And it's usually somebody who we know. It's usually them having a conversation with Orlando and him asking me what I think. And we decide collectively what we want to be on the show. So if we decide that we want somebody on there, we will respond yes.
So when it comes to PR practitioners pitching guests, so Jerry, you mentioned you're not a radio show, right? So it's important that we as the PR practitioners are accurately preparing clients, companies, leaders, whoever is going to be on the show, that this is more than 2 minutes. Donna, your conversations last an hour, right? Jerry, you're 10 to 15 minutes. So when, from a pitching perspective, if somebody's presenting you with an opportunity for somebody to be on the show, do you like them to give you other assets? So would you want to link to another podcast that they were on or a video that they were on? Because you need engaging guests, right? Because if they're a boring interview, that doesn't reflect well upon the show as a whole and then the person who pitched that opportunity.
Oh, for sure. And I like to do research beforehand, whether it's links provided, looking at other things that they've done, because it's important that they're able to carry a conversation. There could be really brilliant people, but if they're not decent on a microphone, if they're not authentic on a microphone, that's going to be really hard for me to carry through and drag over the line. And so we do a lot of the pre-screen. It's something we didn't do, 800 episodes ago, but definitely for now it's, oh, have you done other things? What are other ways that you speak? What are the things you're interested in talking about? What are the kinds of insights? Because audiences want to learn something. They truly want to learn something. They don't want to just get okay, here is the pitch of my thing, but let's talk about the greater industry. Are you willing to say something? Because if you're a guest who's not willing to say something, that doesn't really help us very much, and I know that's difficult for some because I think a lot of people want to stick straight to the 100% script. But if it's somebody who can be engaging, if it's somebody who has different ideas, if it's somebody who's willing to infuse what they're talking about with the things they've learned along their journey and their challenges and the way they've overcome them, then that can start to fill out for a much better podcast interview, because it is a very personal connection in people's ears with a podcast. It's active participation in a lot of ways, because you turn on the TV and it's you walk away, you come back, whatever. The headphones are in while they're gardening or walking their dog or biking or whatever. And we have a real responsibility to keep it moving.
You know what? I think there's a different dynamic when you have two hosts, because Orlando and I will just make jokes with each other. I think sometimes we just, we find humor in things and we keep the conversation going. So I can't really think of a guest who has not been interesting, right? Because we'll ask questions and pull them out. And think of it like somebody coming into your living room and just sitting down, having a casual conversation with you while they're asking you pointed questions about your work. And, both of us may come at it differently, but I can't think of a time. What I would tell people is just be prepared. And what we tell people before we start is we don't want any dead space. So when we ask a question, don't stop and think about it. We'll fill in the dead space. But I don't know. I guess I don't know whether we've been lucky or whether the dynamic of having two interviewers who will also speak to each other helps to address some of that boringness if somebody is not interesting. So, I mean, we usually have fun. The guests usually enjoy themselves. Like I said, how do you loosen people up? We usually do some things to get people comfortable before we start the show, explain to them how it works, crack a few jokes so that by the time the show starts, we're all in a kind of upbeat mood.
Yeah, I think it's good to warm people up. I'd also mention outside of that, make sure if you're talking about a narrative podcast, and you'll know right away that that's going to be clipped together. So that's going to be a whole different thing than, say, a conversation.
Yeah.
So they're going to edit that and clip that together in that more public radio style. And we've done that in situations too, but understand that somebody might interview you for a longer amount of time. So as a PR professional, listen, no, okay, is this going to be a narrative show? If it is, know that this is going to be polished up, clipped together, and you might do 20 minutes of conversation, hour of conversation, and they might throw in, 2 minutes or whatever total in it, but clipped together with different things. So that's why I wanted to add that, even though we don't do narrative every single day, like we'll try to do about once a week, once every 2 weeks, because it is a huge logistical lift to do something like that. It takes, for a narrative podcast, it probably takes 4 times the amount of time to do a narrative show because of the editing and the tweaking. But if you're going to make sure, like when you pitch a show, if it's going to be narrative, if it's going to be storytelling like that, understand that they're going to take clips and put it together, and it's going to look different than, say, a conversation, because not all podcasts are the same.
Great. So we've had a few questions come in. I want to make sure we have time to get to those. So let's wrap up with this last question of what does the future of podcasting look like? So we're having this conversation today because of the explosive rise in podcasts, both from listenership and people starting podcasts. So each of you want to take a minute or so to just share, what do you think the future of the podcasting world looks like? James, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's a couple of things I would mention here. One is there's a kind of interesting rise of these social audio platforms or apps. So there's the most famous one would be Clubhouse, which was kind of seeing explosive growth at one point a few months ago. It's kind of I wouldn't say petered out, but it's not quite growing as wildly as it was. So we'll see how that shakes out, and pretty much every major tech company is releasing their own, in some cases copycats, and in others they've put their own twist on it of these apps. So Twitter has Twitter Spaces, which is a little bit different to Clubhouse, but it's the same kind of concept of social audio. Mark Cuban's released one called Fireside. Facebook's working on their own. So that's pretty interesting. That's these social audio platforms are some kind of pretty unique, really, as a concept, but it's some kind of mix of kind of podcasting and radio in one. It's hard to define, and we'll see if that takes any attention or listeners away from podcasts themselves. A lot of podcasts are also, maybe one of you has started experimenting with one of these. I'd be curious to hear, but a lot of podcasts now have things like, they'll have kind of a fans clubhouse room for their listeners to come and join and talk to them and discuss the episode after an episode, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I think that's one of the main trends I would be paying attention to.
I think a trend that we're seeking to follow is to include video so that people can actually watch. I heard from a colleague that that was something that had made their podcast more successful. The other thing is when we live stream it rather than record it, since we don't edit, we might as well live stream, right? And when we have live stream, people have really, really enjoyed it. So I think adding a video and live stream component gives people real-time connections to what we're saying.
So I'm going to be a little bit different because we asked our audience and they're like, we do other things while we podcast. So I'm a skeptic of the chat audio thing that say James was talking about Clubhouse. I'm a large skeptic of it because I think they're different services for different purposes. I feel like, you know, a person who's listening to a podcast is integrating it into their day while doing other things. If you think about it, if you're listening to an hour-long conversation or something else, they're doing other things. Like some of the top things people are doing is they're biking or they're at home, they're doing chores, things like that. And you're fitting into their day into a very special place. I think the future of podcasting is great. I had Kara Swisher on the show from at the time she was with Vox. Now she's on the New York Times. And one of the things is that I think that the great thing about podcasting can be is that it's a way to do a form of journalism and community connection and get people to learn about things in a way that they will relate to and let the information in their head. And this is important, whether it's a local show like ours or, you know, it's a business show, things like that, where they'll be able to get the information in a lot better because people just don't read like they used to. You know, like you've got 2 swipes on a phone. You know, if you want to go an in-depth topic on anything, I don't care if it's what, you know, I do, or if you're talking about the latest, you know, business trend or whatever, like forcing it through people's emails, like they'll get a headline, they'll scan it. But if you want to create a connection, you need to talk with them and integrate with their day. The way people consume media has changed. Their patterns have changed. They were already changing before the pandemic. I feel like it has accelerated a lot of trends that were already in progress. I also think there's a huge gap between folks who are in there who are older and folks that are younger. You know, for my listeners, to be very honest, they don't watch local news. Like I'm not competing with the TV stations because it's only for a small percentage of them in their diet because it's just not what they do. They don't watch TV. They don't watch TV like that. They might catch a clip of theirs online or something, but it's a cultural shift. And it's important when you think about it, when you think about the age, you know, things that go through, like our average listener is, I believe, 34. You know, so that's a whole different thing than say your average like cable TV news watcher, which is in there. I want to say it's like 50s or 60s. You know, it's like a different thing. So you also got to think about that crosstab as well. When you're thinking about podcasting in general, not always, it is changing as it gets wider, but your audience is going to skew a little bit younger just because of the technology, just because of the cultural differences of how they get together. You know, I remember I was walking down the street over in Midtown and I ran into someone who was a listener. They recognized me and his daughter was with him. It's like, you're the voice in Daddy's shower, you know? And it's like, oh, okay, this is real. Or we were at the DCFC game over the weekend and my sports reporter, Fletcher, you know, it's something where he was surprised when people are like, oh yeah, they want elbow bumps, you know, at the game. Like it's a whole different connection and it's really where the future is. And the question is going to be, how soon does that future arrive in full? How soon does the dollars arrive for advertising? How soon does all the other accoutrement arrive to really make this fly? And that's really going to be the bet with podcasting. And it's not just local, it's any series, any level what you want to do. I think there's a lot of experimentation in the space right now. I think a lot of people say they know what's going to happen, and I don't think they do. And I don't know what's going to happen either. I think people are fickle, and I think that people do things a lot of times that don't make sense, and that's fine because that's an audience and that's how we deal with them.
I think that there are different audiences, as you mentioned, Jared. So there are people who listen to us drive time, listen to us while they're biking, listen to us while they're washing the dishes or whatever. And I've heard that from people. There are other people who don't listen to podcasts. And so how do you grow the audience to people who don't? When we live stream, we bring in new audiences. So we get a lot of participation, people thanking us. And there are people who, quite frankly, are on Facebook in the evenings. And because our podcast is an evening podcast, I'm on Facebook, this pops up, this is interesting. And all of a sudden we have this interaction in real time that we would not have, and audiences that we would not have if we were not also live streaming. So I think that, you know, that's to me a better it's more satisfying than Clubhouse. Some people love Clubhouse. I've tried it and I'm like, why, this is weird. I'm listening to these disembodied voices talk and I don't really vibe with that. And there's many people who do, obviously, but I think ours, again, when you add the video component and when you incorporate live audiences, it changes the dynamic somewhat. And so I think it's going to grow in different ways for different audiences. Right now, our audience not only skews younger, it skews a little bit higher income and wider than I think the audience that we want to reach. I think we want to diversify to include more people in our community and also people who, because we say in our thing, listen to us wherever you listen to podcasts. People are like, what's that? Where do I listen? So, okay, now I got to show you how to use a podcast. You've got this little thing on your phone and you can download it for free. And so we're actually going to be doing podcast training in our neighborhood so that people can understand how to access podcasts and what the universe of podcasting is and grow again the audience.
So we have a couple participant questions. First one is, how can PR professionals make your life easier?
If I got to know some, right? Get to know us. Sit down with Orlando and me and find out what our vision is and connect with what we're trying to do. And that way you understand how to pitch and you can give us recommendations. So I think partnership works with if there was a, especially for small independent podcasts like ours, I just think it's relationships that always make a difference.
Absolutely. I mean, relationships matter. Every mentor I've always said, says, take the meeting. And I'll meet with a lot of people. That won't guarantee anything, but I'll meet with people and talk with folks. I think too, get to know the medium well. I mean, I guarantee there's a podcast on anything you're interested in, whatever it is. Like, I don't care what it is. You will find something in your, whatever it is, whether it's golf or cars or, geckos or literally, I know that there's like a lizard podcast out there that's all about lizard care. There's all kinds of things out there. And so I think getting to know the medium, getting to know like the challenges that we have, growing audience is always key for both of us. And although sometimes we do it in different ways, I think it's still like a key thing. And like we'll do some live stream events and things like that. We had planned to do more in-person events once, everything, then the world, I'll just wave my arms wildly at the world. But like, it's something that as that kind of hopefully recedes, we'll be doing more of that kind of stuff. So always looking to work with folks, always looking to figure out what makes the most sense and, just be open to opportunities. And I think I think for us, it's about being on the same level as, a lot of the other things that you've traditionally pitched, like times change, podcasting is now part of the mix. And, give us a shot and see what works. And I think that would be great.
So James, you mentioned that there were 500,000 active podcasts and growing. So question for everyone, do you feel that the saturation poses any challenges to the future of podcasting? Somebody earlier mentioned, I don't remember if it was you, James, or Jared, but like finding, like you might be in a very niche industry, right? And there's probably a podcast. You just said lizards, Jared, right? So like there seems to be a podcast for every industry, but they're growing every day, right? So do you see any challenges there and saturation of the market?
Well, I think number one to remember is a lot of those podcasts aren't active. Like most podcasts pod fade. I think the average is like 7. Like, so here's a great pitching tip. Make sure the podcast you're pitching to has at least 7 or 10 episodes. Like that's a key thing because then like they're getting over that hump, right? Like if they've only got 3 episodes, you might want to pass on them or put them in your file, then come back to them in a few weeks or a few months, whatever their posting cadence is. But like, I don't see that because for us anyway, what we found is that the vast majority of people come through meeting us, through searching their podcast app, through searching the internet. If people are looking, like if people are interested in your thing and you're good enough, they'll find you.
Yeah.
I disagree with some of the like discovery problems. I think if you hustle, like Donna, what you're saying, what works for you, that's awesome. That's great. If you hustle and you're willing to put in the work, I don't think there's a discovery problem. I think that what you need to do as a podcaster is get yourself out there and be willing to like take the meeting and do the thing. And that means an extra amount of work. And I think that also kind of sets apart the folks who are just kind of like, oh, I'm having a podcast with my friends, which is great. Like that is awesome. You want to do a podcast for fun or just for yourself? that is great. I am not knocking that whatsoever. But if you want to take something to the next level, it is like absolutely every single other thing I've ever done in my entire life. You have to lean in, right? You can't just put it out there and expect people to just like find it. Like you can do your best, you can set yourself up, you can, make sure you're in the directories, all that other things, but then you've got to deliver with what you're doing. And it's going to be different for every podcaster. It just is, because you have different stuff. You have different ways, like depending on the industry. If you're dealing with an industry specific podcast, maybe you've got people who want to like watch it on the background while they're at work or while they're working out, or they're getting insights about how to be a better salesperson. You've got to get to know your market and who you're serving, and then hyper serve them. And even though we both are in Detroit, and Donna, I love the East Side. I am a huge fan of the East Side. My grandmother was over on Iroquois. Okay. So but we aren't the same audience. We're still different and we do different things. And that's one of the reasons why you'll see so many podcasters work together, because we do different things, and that's okay.
So we have a podcast. We have listeners in Scotland, and one of them reached out to me and asked me to join an international conference, Arca Fringe Conference, as a panelist and a guest, and working collaboratively on this project. And never would have happened without Authentically Detroit. How did they find our podcast? They Googled Detroit and we popped up. And Authentically Detroit seemed like a cool name, I guess. And so they listened, and now they listen every week. So they always give us feedback like, hey, I love this story. Can you answer this? And I'm always honored to have that. There's a podcast in St. Louis that wants to collaborate on a project with us. And so we're working on a collaboration. Now it's interesting because we're very different. They are public radio, and we are, although we have a connection to public radio, we're very much, we're non-scripted. As I mentioned, our conversation, our podcast goes on a bit longer. I think whatever you do in life, you have to differentiate yourself, and you have to help people see the value proposition and what you bring to the marketplace. And if you're real clear about your value proposition, you don't worry about the competition. You worry about making yourself better and building on that. And that has been our approach to Authentically Detroit. In 2 weeks, we will have reached our 100th episode. And so that's, kind of amazing to us, because we started out and we weren't quite sure where it was going. And so you can't be worried about the competition. I mean, there will be a culling of the ranks. As Joe mentioned, you have some people who have podcasts, and the last recording they had was in 2017. They're not competition. Now, hopefully the search engines and others will do better of differentiating between active podcasts and inactive podcasts, so that it'll make it an easier listener experience. And, podcasts are ranked. What are your numbers? What do people think about you? You can see it on Apple and other screens, how people are viewing you. And so we are very happy with a 5 rating, right? Small numbers, but a 5 rating nonetheless. You have some who are lower rated, and I think those podcasts might need to, those are the ones that go inactive. Those are the ones just don't continue.
We're getting close to time here, but I wanted to touch on one more thing, and it's a good continuation of what you were just talking about, Donna. How can PR professionals measure the success of getting a guest on a podcast? So you have the publicly visible metrics like the ratings of the podcast itself, but Jared, do PR pros ask you for download numbers?
Generally at this point, no. They used to. Now it's not a question. It's never in the last probably 6 months. And honestly, it's more about, the reality is, and I used to work in broadcast television, is that like podcasts probably have better numbers than I think a lot of people assume. Like Nielsen's kind of a game that we've all kind of agreed to when it comes to broadcast. It's not an exact science. And so really it's about, did that move the needle, and moving the needle can mean a lot of different things. So like in the foundation community, Donna is important. And if you want to reach and talk with people in the foundation community, among others, I'm just pulling that out there as one tab. Like you want to be on that show, right? Because regardless, I don't know the numbers, it doesn't matter, because the people in that community listen to it, right? Like, and that's key. And so it all depends on, what your outcome goals are. Now, if you're looking for a hard metric, I have some general like average statistics that I can kind of share. Every episode's a little bit different. And now that we've done this listener survey, I can kind of tell you like the spray of like where we are in the region, where we are in the city, where we are, in different areas. But I think that the key is going to be like, is this a good win for you? Is it something that you can turn around and share with your audience? Is it in that this is a great way for your team to learn more about your CEO? Or is it something where you can grab a clip from it and say, okay, this is another media place, and then amplify that work in some of the things that you're doing? Because in corporate communications, there is a number of clips, and some of them may reach a lot of people, may not be the best, and vice versa. And you put it into things, and then you put it into a greater package about the person that you're talking to or getting the reach out there. And PR is a little bit different than, say, direct advertising, right? Because one of the biggest things in podcasts is direct advertising, where there's like a promo code, things like that. The hard part with PR is that it doesn't really make sense for us to do that, and track that and things like that. But I think that, and you look at the kind of guests that they get, and it builds up. And if it isn't, as I said, it isn't always about the biggest numbers, because, CNN will tell you that they did like X million people or whatever, but did that really resonate with the people that you want to talk to?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that requires more homework, and I'm sorry, but that's how it is. And I know that there is a level of, you never get fired for buying IBM, right? I get that, right? Like, you're like, okay, I've done CNN. I know this, but like, doing a podcast, I think, can really open a lot of opportunities and reach whole new audiences who honestly normally would never have cared about your thing before.
Okay, final question. Who's the best person you've ever interviewed? Favorite guest?
I don't want to name a name. I don't know if it's my favorite guest, but the best interview was for a candidate. We really asked some questions that had not been asked before. And there were people all over Twitter who were like, wow, I can't believe that. This is really great. If you really want to know about political candidates in our community, you need to go to Authentically Detroit. And so that was really affirming in so many ways, that people were coming to us inside of the neighborhoods that we serve. And that's how another way that we got some additional neighborhood listens. People were coming to us based on word of mouth from other people who listened, who we didn't know.
I'm going to break the rules, and I'm going to say two, one that's more known and one that's unknown, because the reality is that even if you're a known name, sometimes it doesn't resonate on a podcast with your audience. So I'm going to go with a known and an unknown. When it comes to known, I know from my listeners, their favorite is when we had Roman Mars from 99% Invisible on. That was something where we talked about his book, The 99% Invisible City, and all the different ways that you can look at your city and find things and design that you wouldn't have otherwise. And a couple of his sections were about things in Detroit, created in Detroit and Michigan. So we talked about, the Michigan left and things like that. And it was just a fun conversation for people to get involved in their city. And just, you walk down the street, well, why is this building here? Why is the sidewalk this way? Lots of people want to know about that. Second one is more of an unknown, and he's a great guy, but like, he's not a political guy. He was a student, and he had a plan to reset up Detroit's bus shelters in a way that was far more efficient. He went through, did a whole study at Wayne State University, like all this stuff. Unfortunately, very few of his recommendations were taken up, but he went through and did a data-driven survey of like, okay, here are the bus routes. Here are the people using the most bus shelters. He found that the bus shelters hadn't been moved in 6 years, but the traffic patterns had changed greatly with where the bus shelters are. And I don't know why it took off. I mean, afterward, I found out like why, because it resonated. It was real. It was, this is a simple way that could cost, $20,000-$30,000, move the shelters and get a much better result. And I think people are clamoring for those kind of solutions in the city, where it's like, stop, just make the city work. Like people just want the city to work. And so ideas that make the city work, make the city better. And, they do really well. And so that was one of my favorites, really engaging. I think he's at he was at Wayne State. Now he's at U of M. I still, once in a while hear from him, but that was another favorite one because he was just passionate about what he was doing. And I think he was right. And I think, it's something where there was a missed opportunity where this could be really good, so those are my answers.
All right, Donna, Jared, James, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody who was listening in.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the recording here, and we can kick off the networking.